Welcome to another one of our client market updates. I'm recording this session. We'll send it out probably in the next couple of days. So if there's a slide or a topic that you want to go back and rewatch, you'll be able to do that. Before I get started today and introduce Josh Bennett, who's going to be doing most of today's presentation on the U.S. housing market, if you're new to our live events platform, you should see a menu bar on the bottom of your screen. If you go down there real quick, you'll see a little smiley face icon. If you can hear my audio okay, give me some kind of thumbs up, Giphy reaction. Just make sure my audio is coming through for you okay. Wonderful. Right next to that, there's a little chat call out. If you click on that, you'll see a group chat. During the presentation, while Josh is talking, myself and a few other team members are on this market update. If you have a question as we're going through, don't hesitate to put it in the chat. At the end of the presentation, I'll unlock everybody's microphone. We've left a half an hour at the end for questions and answers for Q&A. So if you want, you can hold your question till the end. I'll kick your mic on. You can interact with us. Otherwise, feel free to type in your question as we're going through the presentation today. Okay, we have a packed agenda for today. If you haven't been on one of our market updates before, we generally cover more than we probably should. That is also the case for today. Today's focus is going to be the U.S. housing market. We're going to take a little bit of a roundabout way to get there. We're going to talk a little bit about interest rates and the overall economy. Then we're going to dive into some very specific things impacting the U.S. real estate market, most specifically residential real estate, although we do have some stuff in there about investment properties and commercial properties. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to jump back in and talk about some of the risks that I see people who are both in retirement and accumulators like myself facing, what some of the big challenges are. And then we're also going to talk about a couple of practical applications, specifically for people who are nearing retirement around managing your real estate, and or if you've been planning to use your real estate, say your primary house or secondary residence, to fund long-term care or things like this. We're going to talk about some planning implications for that. All right, by way of quick introduction, Josh Bennett is a certified financial planner, also an enrolled agent. His background is in taxes. He can go as nerdy as we want to go, both on investments, taxes, and all things planning. He's the head of our strategic relationships here at Lifeworks and is also a key member of our investment team. So Josh, anything I missed with your intro? Otherwise, feel free to share your screen. I'm going to jump off the stage here and let you take it away.
No, that was perfect. Yeah, as Ron said, I'm Josh, and looking forward to diving in here. Let me share my screen while I'm doing that. Can everybody hear me all right?
I'm not getting your audio. Can everybody else hear Josh okay? Okay, everybody can hear Josh all right? Awesome. Okay.
All right, perfect. All right. All right, now that the mic check's done, we'll kind of start diving in. Yeah. All right, so kicking things off, we're going to start with the economy. And as Ron kind of mentioned, we sort of, obviously right now in the economic environment, there's a lot going on. So there's a lot of things that we could talk about, but just with the thought of, kind of real estate markets as being the forefront of this conversation, we sort of tailor the economic conversations to the thing that are going to be really relevant to what I've been going over here with the housing market here in just a minute. That being said, there's some big updates from the Federal Reserve here over the past week that I think are worth really exploring. So one of the big updates from the Federal Reserve is they didn't flat out come in and say that, like, hey, we expect a recession in 2025, which, some of the news articles out there may have you think. But basically, they did come out and say that, they're expecting slower growth and a little bit more inflation coming in the future. So with that, they have changed their expectations on how quickly they're going to drop rates, seemingly to prevent upsetting the economy more than things like tariffs are already doing. So what we sort of expect to see is, they're still going to likely cut rates, which will obviously have an impact on mortgage rates, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. But they're probably going to do it more slowly than they otherwise would have anticipated, just to kind of keep the things steady and to prevent any more, crazy news coming out in the economic world. So one other big data point that I think is going to have a very big impact in terms of like our conversation on the housing markets is talking about real wages. So real wages over time, we talked about this a little bit in our last presentation, but real wages have essentially stayed fairly consistent for decades. So we haven't really seen a massive uptick even though we're seeing all sorts of values and stuff pop in terms of the stock market and growth of GDP. But right now, that's really not going back to the consumer. Wages have not really increased all that significantly over time. And that plays a big impact on some of the things that we're, again, going to talk about as we go into the housing market details. But one thing that has increased pretty drastically is consumer credit, so debt. So things, as we all know anecdotally, things in life have gotten more expensive. Assets have gotten more expensive, eggs have gotten more expensive, and just daily life has gotten more expensive. So a lot of that's been fueled, since wages aren't increasing, people's lifestyles haven't necessarily changed, but that's basically being fueled by debt, which is going to have impacts on both the housing market, planning, and all sorts of things. Just because eventually debt bubbles, there's only so much debt you can get before the bubble bursts. So this is something that's fairly concerning when we look at the financial markets and the economy, is how much debt consumers are taking on right now.
And Josh, jump back one slide. Sorry to interrupt you. I just want to make sure, because you and I were talking about this. This is one of my favorite, not favorite, because I think it's actually kind of sad, but if I'm looking at this correct, you indexed real median household income, right, which is income adjusted for inflation, and total consumer debt at the beginning of 2000. And consumer debt has essentially tripled and wages have essentially stayed flat.
Correct.
So the takeaway is there's 3 times more debt relative to the income in the average US household today. And interest rates have risen over the last couple of years now at the fastest pace in recorded history, correct?
Yep. And actually,
I guess maybe you'll get to it, but the question is that sustainable? All right, I'll jump back off. I'll let you get back to your.
We're going to talk more about that in the context, especially when it comes to like mortgages and housing costs here in a second. But I think an interesting anecdote when we look at credit and kind of thinking through the different interest rates, even though this is more, I'd say on the consumer credit side, like with credit cards and things like that. But when interest rates started spiking at the fastest rate in history a couple of years ago, credit card interest rates got to a level that literally our planning software couldn't even go to because it just had not gone to that level in recorded past or since like tech had been a thing or since the 1980s. So yeah, on top of just the amount of credit card debt and consumer debt that's out there, you factor in the rise in interest rates that we've had. That's really put a restriction in terms of people's ability to spend on things like houses. And I mean, it's going to have ripple effects into other areas of finances as well, especially for younger generations that are coming up. But definitely is a pretty startling number as we start to think through some of these things. But some of this has been driven, and this will have again, a big impact on our conversation around the housing market, but basically something that we've seen over the past 4 to 5 years, especially, I mean, you can see kind of going back all the way to the 60s, this is the M2 money supply. So if you're not familiar with the M2 money supply this is basically the money printing from the Federal Reserve Bank and how much money is just being thrown out into the world, right? One thing worth noting is, this area right here with COVID, obviously that number shot up pretty drastically. I mean, as we all well know from the news articles, the government spent a lot of money trying to prevent the catastrophe around COVID, right? I forget the exact number, but somewhere in like the $8 trillion, right? And so what that did is basically put a ton of money supply into the markets. That money had to go somewhere. And what we saw is it basically went into assets and inflation. And and primarily asset inflation. And the biggest place that hit is the stock market and the housing market. A article I shared with our team recently actually even showed like that if you look at the S&P 500 returns since COVID, even though the markets have shot up, when you take out the inflation component, it's actually pretty steady. Like really didn't grow that much. So really basically what we've seen is a lot of money got printed and got put into the markets, and that went into things like stock market and housing values. And that's what's been a big component in driving the housing markets up to the values that we're seeing right now. And again, we know this anecdotally, but seeing the data, like you really see from the time that that money started printing, you can see the nice big jump up pretty drastically, almost 25+% in terms of just growth in terms of the average value of a home. And obviously this only shows the average US home value, where if we highlight different areas like San Francisco, Austin, New York, I mean, the values here in this chart pale in comparison to what we're seeing in some of the metro areas in terms of inflation and the housing markets. But this even still gives you a good idea that like housing markets have obviously jumped up pretty drastically in a pretty short window. And again, outside of the just printing of money and putting that in the market, one of the big drivers has been low inventory. And there's lots of different causes for this. Some of the main causes are we're at 3% interest rates for a long period of time, where anyone here that has a 3% mortgage rate, especially when if you go buy a new house right now, you're going to be at 5 or 6%. It's very hard to justify, or it takes a lot more work to justify selling your house to go trade in for a 6% mortgage rate. So what we're seeing is a lot of people choosing to stay put just because they're locked in at historically low interest rates, right? So that's prevented a lot of inventory from coming into the market. But this inventory number is going to be very important to a conversation we're going to have later in terms of demographics. But so kind of remember how historically low this is, because it's going to have some pretty big impacts. But this has been one of the big drivers of value is just a pure supply and demand equation. So we have little supply and a lot of demand, which means values go up. And they've gone up to the point, and again, with wages staying stagnant, asset values going up, debt going up, people aren't able to afford as much. And I think this is really shown here in terms of we were at near record highs in terms of home affordability. So what the value of the home is compared to the income and wages of a house. So we're at some of the highest I've ever seen. Oh, sorry about that. Phone is ringing. Apologies if you guys can hear that. I think this is really important to highlight that we're at some of the lowest affordability of homes in our history. And that's going to have fairly large impacts on the sustainability of the housing market today. Obviously, we don't want to be in the game. We don't have crystal balls of predicting where the housing market's going to go, and is it going to crash? When's it going to crash? We don't want to get in that prediction game. But there is some data showing that houses are pretty unaffordable right now, and that could have some pretty drastic impacts. Another factor really driving the affordability of homes right now is mortgage rates. So we obviously talked about people locked in at the 3%, and then mortgage rates now at around 6%, but they've jumped up quickly, in line with the Federal Reserve raising their own rates for the fastest in history. Mortgage rates have also done something similar. Granted, historically, we're not even close to record highs in terms of mortgage rates. I doubt we'll, get there anytime in the near future, right? But we factor in the significant rise in housing values at even just a marginally higher interest rates. It has a pretty drastic impact on the affordability on a month-to-month mortgage payment when you're factoring in, how much house a person can afford, especially when you're paying off student loan debt, credit card debt, and just normal life expenses and increases. And that's why you hear a lot of the stories and news articles talking about why it's so hard for up and coming generations to be able to afford a house anymore. And this is one of the main factors, is just the increase in mortgage rates on top of the values have really made it expensive. Another factor worth noting here and kind of looking at the risks of the housing market currently are the increase in what we would classify as like dangerous loans. So everyone obviously remembers 2008 and the impacts that had there, where you had these variable adjusted mortgages or variable rate mortgages, and essentially zero money down mortgages and high risk mortgages that essentially caused the 2008 collapse. Granted, there were a lot of other factors that went into it, but that was a driver of it. Well, something that we're seeing in the markets now, if you're not familiar with like FHA loans are basically the government supported loan program to make houses more affordable. But about 64% of FHA insured loans in 2024 had a debt to income ratio of above 43%, which, to put that in context, one, in 2007, ahead of the Great Recession and ahead of the market, housing market crash, it was about 35%. But to put that in more perspective, us as financial planners typically use, say, like a 28% number to understand if a house is affordable for someone that we're planning with. And even that is sort of the, especially in my opinion, the tippy top of what you want to go in terms of home affordability. So when you get to like a 43% income ratio, that means these houses are really unaffordable to the people that are buying them. So these loans are being issued almost with a fair certainty that the person that is buying them cannot afford the house that they're going into, which is going to have ripple effects that affect the overall housing market. And with that too, not only are these houses not affordable to the people that are buying them, they're at significantly higher values than they've seen in recent history, right? So that, again, those higher values in the FHA homes, if these loans start collapsing, could have a large ripple effect in terms of the overall housing market. Ron, looks like you're wanting to chime in on something.
No, I was just going to say, back to that debt to income ratio slide, right? Unlike maybe the subprime mortgage crisis from the 07, 08 period, where there was a lot of what they called no income, no asset, like subprime loans. These are people that have disclosed their income and assets, right? Theoretically. But when we think about 43% of their gross income is going just to pay the mortgage payments, that to me seems like one thing goes wrong, and it's such a high percentage, right? I mean, if 10% just goes for their payroll taxes, and maybe another 15% to 20% on average is for state and federal local taxes, right? That leaves them maybe 20% of their gross income to pay for all their living, lifestyle expenses, student loans. I mean, it seems like a crazy threshold.
Well, especially, I forget the exact statistic for right now, but I mean, the average college graduate's coming out with about 40+ thousand in student loan debt, which is about $200, $150 to $200 a month in terms of payments at current interest rates. So, I mean, they're coming out with $800 a month just in student loans. So then you add in the 43% debt to income on top of that, or like affordability, like the numbers just start to not add up pretty quickly. And that's just two numbers that are pretty much everyone that we see graduating college have. Anyways, anything else you wanted to add?
I'll stay on here. I'll stay on here actually, because I think the next slide coming in your presentation is one that I was going to jump in and make some comments on. So if you want to just put it back on the slideshow, awesome.
Yeah, I'll kick off on the slide, and do you want to kick off and just kind of go over it?
Yeah, let me walk through this one a second. So one of the things we try not to do here at Lifeworks, which is unusual, most financial pundits, advisors, firms, big firms on Wall Street will try and predict or forecast where things are going, right? They'll say, because Trump tariffs are doing this, we should be in this sector of the market, or because this is happening over here economically, like this is going to happen over here. And we know, as does every good academic researcher, that 99% of the time those things are wrong. But what we can look at is we can look at demographics and things that are factual, that are dyed in the wool. So what we're looking at here is actually a graph that I've been paying attention to for a long time. I apologize for the colors. I tried to make it as easy for us to read. This is U.S. real estate ownership by generation. And it's actually in the trillions of dollars. It's not percentages. The Federal Reserve actually tracks the total amount of assets by generation. And so what you see here is the dark blue on the bottom is a silent generation. That would be people born before 1946. The bright blue in the middle is the baby boomer generation. That's 1946 to 1964. So just some basic arithmetic here. That means the youngest baby boomer in 2025 is going to be 61 years old, and the oldest baby boomer is going to be 79. Okay. There's 100 million baby boomers-ish, and 80% of them own a primary residence. So in the next 10 to 15 years, there's going to be 80 million homes going for sale in the market. Now, Josh, you and I were talking about this right before we jumped on. What was it? Something like 4 million or 5 million homes a year are sold in the US?
It's like on average between 4 and 4.5 million.
Yeah, something like this. So why do we think this is an important slide to put on here? Well, for all of you that are baby boomers, right, or maybe late Gen Xers that are holding real estate, we have no idea where the price of real estate will go in the future. Josh has laid out some very convincing things that start to talk about the there's the housing inventory. That sort of talk about what are impacting the price, right? Easy money supply, low interest rates, creating a significant surge in home prices. But what we know about the law of supply and demand is that when that inverts, when there becomes more supply of houses relative to buyers, right, all things being equal, the price of something will likely fall. So I've talked to thousands of people in my almost 2 decades now as a financial advisor about their plans in retirement for their homes. I've also got to talk to thousands of families, second and third generation. And an interesting point here is that most families, in my experience, the kids and the grandkids don't want the house or the houses of their parents. Okay? Now, exceptions here might be like family farm or some beautiful lakefront property. There are a few exceptions. And if you're not already planning for those exceptions, there's an entire planning cycle that we should take you through about planning for multi-generational real estate ownership. It's called cottage law planning, but set that aside when we make that an educational video. But the important thing here is that if you're in that baby boomer demographic and you own one or more residential pieces of real estate, you and the other 100 million of you will invariably be selling those pieces of real estate over the next 10 to 20 years. This is part of what is called by sociologists and economists as the great wealth transfer. The largest transfer of wealth in human history will be happening starting now forward for the next 10 to 20 years. Now, I hope everybody lives many, many, many years and medical advancements make it so that the average life expectancy of a person goes from, say, 80 years old to 100. Right. But right now, the average life expectancy of a male in the US is like 78.5 years old, and the female is something like 81 or 82 years old. Right. So oldest baby boomer turned 79 this year, youngest baby boomer is 61. There's going to be a massive amount of real estate that will be coming on the markets. And again, not trying to forecast or prognosticate about what that means for valuations, but just knowing something like this, it's a dyed-in-the-wool thing. It's not going to change, right? So there are implications to how we should be thinking about potentially using those assets in retirement, maybe when to sell or how to sell. I'll talk about this at the end of the presentation because I mean to jump this far on. I know Josh has some more about reverse mortgages or ways of thinking about kind of locking in some of those values today going forward. But just know we've got baby boomers that have an unprecedented, looking at this historically, dispersion of wealth, right? It's about 70% of all the publicly traded equities too, all the stocks in the market are held by baby boomers, and about 50% of all the real estate wealth. Okay, so on the real estate side of things, well, homes have become very unaffordable for the average American. Right, there will be a massive number of homes coming up for sale in the next 10 to 15 years. And we think that warrants a in-depth discussion at an individual level for each of our clients about how to think about that as it relates to your financial plan. So there's no recipe that our team is going to be talking about that I think applies to everybody across the board. But on an individual level, I think being very thoughtful about how to potentially use this asset, right, for your financial plan, or what some of the things might look like, right, 5 years from now and 10 years from now on a personal financial planning level. So anyway, Josh, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, and I mean, adding on to that too, I mean, just kind of putting that in context. I mean, if say the transition of that many houses happened over 10 years, you have the capacity to essentially triple the inventory in a very short period of time, if not even more, right? So I mean, just kind of visualize what that could happen to the housing market. I mean, obviously there's still demographics coming up that would love to buy a home, but it could really have some lasting impacts. Another big demographic change that is fairly new, I'd say, but it's been driving a lot of attention, especially recently with like the LA fires and the hurricanes that we had this past hurricane season, is how insurance companies and weather are changing the demographics and also affecting the housing market in a lot of ways. So this chart basically shows where the values of housing prices, like where blue is like basically where housing values are still increasing, yellow is where housing values are currently decreasing. Notice that a lot of the yellow is in areas that are pretty fire ridden, as well as like hurricane ridden. There's a pretty big concentration there. And what we're seeing is like in places like Florida and California, a lot of insurance providers are pulling out of those areas, and or if they're staying in, they're forcing drastic increases in the cost of insurance. So that has an impact on mortgages. For example, you can't close a mortgage without insurance. And so it's in mortgage companies and also insurers are, afraid to insure or finance properties at this risk level currently, especially, when in St. Pete, where two hurricanes hit back to back. I mean, a lot of the insurers are a little scared of that happening again for obvious reasons, right? Same with like the fires in LA and all the fires that we've seen in California, like in Napa and different areas year over year. Like there's been a lot of headlines, and the risks are becoming very real for insurers and mortgage companies. And that's again affecting. But other like anecdotal parts of this is, if you look at places like Florida, for example, a lot of the market there is driven by Airbnb speculators that had properties there, retirees that have second homes there, things like that. So you're also seeing some of that where, like, if I had a second home in Florida, yeah, and my insurance went up 4x, I'd be considering selling it too, right? So you're seeing some of these things sort of force change, even if it wasn't necessarily in a plan or not. And like some of you, this may apply to directly as well. Like you may have a second, I know a lot of Midwesterners like to snowbird in Florida for the winter. So, I mean, this could very much affect you. Honestly, we don't necessarily have really any idea of how this is going to change over time, but I mean, it definitely is having an impact one way or another in terms of housing values, especially in these areas that are prone to natural disasters. And I'm not going to dwell on rental properties and stuff too long because this won't apply to everybody, but I think it's worth pointing out, like in terms of real estate from like an investment perspective, as opposed to just a primary residence or secondary residence perspective. But when you think of like rental properties, there's really just two ways of driving value. There's really income, or there's income and there's appreciation, right? So the value of your house increases, so you can sell it for more, or you get money for cash flow from renters. With inflation and things like that going up, rent has gone up as well for most places. But if you have a rental property, something that you may want to consider is not factoring in appreciation as part of either buying a rental property, holding a rental property, or anything like that, just because it is becoming less and less certain that you'll be able to count on any appreciation going forward for the near future. I think things like rent will be fairly stable because of inflation. There's still a risk, with the, again, the kind of baby boomer transition with more houses coming on the market and stuff, that you won't be able to sustain as high level of rent, which is worth, again, considering from a planning perspective of, hey, do I want to factor in something that has a higher rent if it's not sustainable long term. So these are considerations worth thinking through. But definitely, if you're thinking about having a rental property, you already own a rental property, it's definitely worth talking through with your advisor on like whether appreciation is a big factor of that and whether you should consider that into the future. The other real estate market I think is worth pointing out is the REIT market. So if you're not familiar with REITs are essentially a real estate investment trust is what it stands for. It's essentially real estate that's bundled up and traded like a stock. So it is traded on like the public markets. So the downside with REITs is, for example, if you have a rental property or a primary residence, no one's coming to your property, putting a stake in the ground that, broadcasts what your value is of your property on a daily or even minute by minute or second by second basis, right? And that's one reason that real estate markets are typically so stable is it's harder to sell real estate. There's no one broadcasting values. So it's a lot of just comparables. So the real estate market's much slower in terms of changing value. The REIT market is not that way. The REIT market, while it can be great from a diversification perspective because it can give you exposure to a lot of different real estate in a very easy to, purchase way, it also is very correlated to things like stocks because when things get scary, you can go sell it at a click of a button. And that's exactly what happened during COVID is we saw in the span of a month, basically a 40% drop in the REIT market. This dropped even more than stocks did during the COVID crash. And so that's something to be very cognizant of if you're thinking of diversifying into real estate, outside or, thinking through real estate as an investment outside of like your primary or secondary residence, something to be very cognizant of that there are real risks when it comes to especially short-term volatility in terms of investing in REITs. Especially, again, considering some of these warning signs that we've been talking about, like you could have some reactions to the markets that could have some pretty quick responses and sustained responses as well. So what are some things you should be doing? So one, revisit your financial plan before making investment decisions. These are the things we kind of preach on an ongoing basis. Make sure you're focusing on cash flow. Like these things haven't necessarily changed. And Ron kind of hit on a primary thing, like thinking through things like how does my primary residence or how does real estate in my portfolio affect my ability to live the life I want to live? Coming back to some of those decisions and some of that planning with your advisor can have a really real impact. I think now of all times is really worth doubling down and re-exploring that. I know Ron's going to dive into that a little bit more here in a second, so I'll sort of pause there with that. But I did want to touch on the equity markets a little bit before Ron dives in. I know we're primarily focusing on the housing market, but there's obviously been a lot of news in the equity markets. So at least wanted to touch on it, at least if you weren't in our last conversation or presentation last month, just at least give you a quick highlight of what's going on to sort of hopefully put some fears at ease. But basically the story in the equity markets over the past 10 years is the story of 7 stocks. So primarily all the growth primarily in the S&P 500, for example, has been driven by 7 companies like Apple, Google, NVIDIA. Those are some of the main drivers, and you can kind of see this here. So like the colors are a little off, but basically the bottom is what the S&P 500 minus the top 7 companies. You have the S&P 500 here in the middle, and then this is the growth of the top 7 companies. So you can kind of see that the Magnificent Seven, as they're called, are essentially pulling the S&P 500 up compared to like where otherwise should be. So that's been on the growth perspective. But what we're seeing now is basically it became such a concentrated part of the S&P 500 over that 10 years. So the top 7 companies now make up about 40% of the S&P 500, which is an astronomical number. These companies are at some of the highest values in history. When you look at like, massive companies throughout history, they're there. And they're still priced though, like they're young growth startup companies. And so they're built on speculation right now. I mean, obviously they're all still solid companies with, that are doing very well and building cool things. But from a stock price perspective, there's a lot of expectations of growth built in. And once you get to these kind of valuations, there's only so much room you can go up, at least as history has taught us. And so what we've seen over the past month or so is if those expectations or those ideas of how much a company can grow start to change, it could have some pretty quick impacts on a speculative company. And that's exactly what's happened. Like a prime example is what happened with NVIDIA about a month and a half ago. So if you're not familiar with NVIDIA basically makes all the GPUs that go into things like AI, crypto, and obviously the things that are growing really rapidly right now, and innovations. Well, China came out with a news article that basically said their new AI called DeepSeek basically didn't need the same computing power as our AI in the US. And so therefore, powerful GPUs like NVIDIA was known for were no longer needed. So that one news article basically wiped out 20% of NVIDIA in a day. And then we're sort of seeing the same thing now happen with Google, Apple, and some of these other companies with the tariffs. Obviously, no one has a crystal ball and no one can predict exactly what's going to happen with the outcomes of these tariffs. But the fear of it impacting how much it costs for an iPhone to get built or things like that is having a real impact on the growth expectations for those companies, and therefore, causing them to go down. But I think something that's worth really highlighting here is, again, the orange line is that's those 7 companies, and they're down almost 15%, and bringing the stock market down with them as a whole. And that's why you see all the news articles and pundits that are saying like, hey, we're entering a recession, or all these different things kind of to scare you. But if we look at the other 493 companies, they're basically flat, not growing, not changing. They're basically still just chugging along. And as Ron's going to highlight, that's kind of why we do our investments differently, is to prevent these exact scenarios for you. But I think it's really worth highlighting that a lot of the hysteria going on right now is really just these 7 companies, and that's primarily it. Oops, clicked the wrong place. But also wanted to at least highlight the gold markets too. So what we see in economies like this is people flight to safety, and gold is kind of historically the flight to safety location, right? And that's the asset class that people sort of view as warm and fuzzy. And so when they take money out of riskier assets, gold is one of the places that they go for safety. And so we've seen an uptick in the gold markets, and again, without a crystal ball, who knows in the future, but if things like tariffs and stuff continue to be part of the news cycle, I would guess that would continue to go up as well. Another thing we're seeing is Bitcoin, is the markets there have stabilized a little bit. They're still fairly correlated to things like the tech markets. So that's why we saw a lot of volatility. But one of the things to really understand with the Bitcoin markets, especially, that could have a large impact here over the next couple of years is regulations right now have a big impact on the Bitcoin market, just because a lot of things like endowments, insurance companies, and the players in the game that have the big money, we'll say, typically avoid Bitcoin, whether it's because their bylaws, their investing restrictions, things like that, especially because there's no guidelines and regulations when it comes to how to handle Bitcoin currently. But Trump has talked in the news about potentially having a Bitcoin reserve in the U.S., and he's been pushing for regulatory guidelines when it comes to the treatment of crypto. That could have a very positive tailwind in terms of how the Bitcoin price appreciates over the near future. Again, no one has a crystal ball, and especially when it comes to politics, your guess is as good as mine of what gets passed and what goes through. But just something worth kind of keeping an eye on in terms of the appreciation, because Bitcoin is very much a displayer of supply and demand. And if there becomes more demand from some of the bigger players like the institutional money because of regulations, then it could really increase the asset price. All right, and now I'll kick it off to Ron.
Awesome. I know we covered a lot there. Slides will be available, and so will the recording from this. Feel free, guys, if you want to throw any questions. I'll let Josh wet his palate there, and I'll maybe answer some questions while I'm talking. So I'm going to put some slides back up here, but before I do, I fielded a phone call from a client of Lifeworks this week. I don't get to do very many of those, unfortunately. In my role here as a CEO, I spend most of my time fielding phone calls from vendors and investors and compliance things and stuff like this. But I got a chance to have a conversation with them. And these are some, really dear clients. I've enjoyed working with them for years. And they were really worried about, I'm not just going to say the markets, but the current environment we were in, right? Specifically looking at, the current political environment. And I have no idea where everybody on this leans. And in full disclosure, I dislike all politicians of all stripes and varieties. So not going to make this political at all, but their worries and their concerns that they wanted to talk with me about, I think were very valid, which is, what if the current administration and the policies that they're pursuing is going to lead to a collapse in the U.S. economy, right? And instead of addressing it in a political way, which is unfortunately how I think most of us have to consume knowledge when we're looking at it, whether it's on some kind of news or blogs or reading, right? Most of those are biased. I just stepped back and said, let's just talk about what the real risk actually is. And the real risk is not market volatility, and it's not a president or an administration running the US economy off a cliff. There's certainly the possibility of that. What I referenced was actually Warren Buffett's annual shareholder letter from 2024. And I said, this isn't going to make any of us feel warm and fuzzy or, go to bed at night and feel great about this. But the reality is that the private free markets, of which we are sort of, limited free markets, our capitalistic approach to wealth building in the United States, is the greatest mechanism for navigating political uncertainties. Meaning, Coca-Cola, Walmart, Apple, Tesla, like pick a giant company, they're going to find ways to make money and make their product and sell it, regardless of whether there's a Democrat in office or a Republican in office. And I gave a couple of examples. I said, November of 2016, I fielded a phone call from a client. This was right before I was starting Lifeworks. And Donald Trump had just been announced the winner of the 2016 election. And this client said, everything that I have tomorrow when the market opens, I want to sell it and get me out of the market. This is going to be a disaster for the US economy. And I said, I don't think that's the right approach, but you're calling the ball, so we'll make sure it happens. And we did. The next morning, our team liquidated this person's account to cash. Well, what ended up happening? Well, the next few years, we went on just an absolute tear in the US equity markets. And the current president took a victory lap for that. Not the point. I said, then fast forward to 2020, and President Biden gets elected. And another group of people called our team and said, this guy's going to run the country off the map. He's a socialist, commie, like whatever the adjectives were. We want to get out of the market. And we did our best to talk almost everyone out of that. There's maybe a dozen or so that called. And what ended up happening? We had COVID, which was not any foreseen event. But the market then from there to today has been on still the greatest bull market run the world has ever seen. And my point to this client that called about the worry of market volatility or a politician or a group of politicians enacting policy that drives their investments to zero. I said the recent history would show us that those fears, while being valid, because it's an emotion that we hold, are not a likely outcome. And the difference between possibility and probability should be acknowledged. But then I said to them, and this is where I'm going to share my screen here, and this will tie to the housing market. I promise I will get there without taking a long time. This will tie back to the housing market, and then we'll talk about some financial planning considerations. Josh and I will go after it. What I said to them is the real risk that we face is not that the market is going to go up and down in value. That can actually be managed. The real risk that we face is that everything that you and I need to live on is going to cost us more every year for the rest of our life. So when we look back at history and we pull as much of our emotions and bias out of it as we can, which it's never perfect for any of us to do, but when we try and do that, what we see is regardless of politician or political party that's in power, they all have spent more. And the US national debt has gone do, 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 do. And when the US government has deficit spending and when the Federal Reserve increases the money supply, that drives inflation. Now, there's an economic argument to be made whether you're Keynesian or Austrian, like that's not the point. The historical record is that as our government spent more and as our debt load has increased, as the money supply has increased, inflation has been this unstoppable, slow-moving train. Now, for those of you that were alive during the 70s, that lived through that stagflationary period where interest rates were double-digit, the stock market was in the tank, and things kept costing more, but the economy wasn't growing, like that's like the worst economic outcome you could possibly have, okay? But when we look back at history, what we see is that the real risk that we face is not a politician for a period of time running the equity markets off of a cliff. In fact, publicly traded companies, by the way, tend to donate to both political parties fairly equally because they hedge their bets because they're in the business of making money, right? Selling goods and services. So again, not trying to make this political, but I wanted to cover this because the world we live in right now, there will likely be headlines of scary natures that are consistently coming out, right? It's actually what creates revenue for all of those websites and news organizations. But this is the real risk that all of us face, guys, is not that the market's going to go up and down in the short run or that the housing market's going to crash or something like that. Those things happen over time. They're actually quite normal when you look back at history. They're not fun, but they're normal. But the real risk that all of us face is that everything you and I need to live on is going to cost us more every year for the rest of our life. So what we should be asking then is, how do we think about positioning in light of this, I'll say, factual truth? So this is a quick graph. We've already seen a lot. I won't dwell here. Cost of goods and services has more than doubled. Now, healthcare, nursing home care, certain elements of food and energy have gone up much higher than this. But this is just the consumer price index for all urban consumers. It leads us to this truth, which I've covered. The risk is that everything we need to live on is going to cost us more. Let me put this in context of investments real quick, and then we'll talk about how this plays into thinking about real estate, financial planning, and why I wanted to kind of end our market update here. When we look at the performance of the stock market, and this is the S&P 500, looking at it on an annualized basis from January to December every year, right? If we invested $1,000 in 1972 in the S&P 500, the blue area of the chart is what it would be worth today in what's called nominal value, just what it would have grown to. The orange part of the chart is what it would have grown to in real value terms, meaning adjusting the return for inflation. Warren Buffett, at the end of his 2024 shareholder letter, and I don't think we can invest like Warren Buffett. We are not trying to be Warren Buffett, but I thought that this statement was very wise and was worth calling out. He said this: paper money can see its value evaporate if fiscal fallacy prevails. Paper money can see its value evaporate. In some countries, this reckless practice has become the habitual, and in our country's short history, the US has come close to the edge. Now, fixed coupon bonds, interest-bearing things, CDs, bonds, and in some respects, investment real estate, that functions a little bit differently, but things that you're investing in because they have some type of interest-bearing element to it feel safe, but they provide no protection against a runaway currency. Now, I would argue, if I had the opportunity to sit and have Diet Coke with Mr. Buffett, that fiscal folly has been more of the norm, not the exception in the US. Because Josh showed earlier in the presentation the M2 money supply, right? The Federal Reserve, the federal government, monetary policy on one side, fiscal policy on the other, the Federal Reserve pumping massive amounts, an unprecedented amount. I think it was something like $7 trillion over a year and a half during that COVID time into the economy. And then the federal government going from $1 trillion a year deficit, which should not be a normal thing for me to say, to a $3, $4, $5 trillion a year types of deficit. Like that insane injection of cash into the economy is going to create an inflationary headwind for a while. And I think we're going to still be living that. So as we think about how do we respond to these things, I wanted to kind of wrap up the presentation where we're talking about the housing market. We'll shift to talking about some financial planning elements here, because as I was having this conversation a couple of days ago with these clients, what I said to them was this: the only hedge that our team can find to mitigate the risk of inflation eroding your purchasing power, to stay ahead of this seemingly unstoppable freight train of everything that you need to live on is going to cost you more every year for the rest of your life, is to be invested in assets that have a high probability of outpacing inflation. And what would that be? That would be the US equity market for the most part. Now, real estate has a component I'm going to tie to that, because there's a conversation to have about, is the home that you live in an investment? My answer is no. It might be going up on paper, but the only traditional way that you realize the value of that is you have to sell it and then you have to pay for somewhere else to live. So hang on to that just for a second. The real risk is inflation. Now at Lifeworks, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because all of you are more than likely clients, so you've heard this preached to you from your advisors, but how we decide to allocate our clients' assets in the market has nothing to do with how we feel about a certain sector or how we feel about a politician or whether we think interest rates are going up or down or any of that kind of traditional prognostication, because all of those things are just a fool's errand. They're generally all wrong when people do that. But what we know is when we own the right type of asset for when we need to spend the money. One, we hedge against short-term market volatility. So if you're in retirement right now, we likely have between 1 and 3 years of your retirement income sitting in what I would say safer types of assets, meaning they're not going up and down in the market, but those assets are likely losing to inflation. So they're not good to hold for a long term. Okay, so if you thought the market was going to hell in a handbasket and you went to cash, you're very likely going to lose, high probability that you're going to lose, because you're going to miss out on the growth opportunity. Whoops. We can't time the market. We can't time the real estate market. We can't time the equity market, but we can time when we need to spend the money. Here's the tie to the housing market today. If your home or your real estate is a significant portion of your net worth or a significant number, it's worth thinking about when would you likely have to spend those dollars. Okay. In your financial plan, if you have plenty of money in your retirement accounts and your investment accounts, and working with your advisor, you're like, hey, we're never going to need to spend this money, then maybe you can say, okay, we're just going to let kids or trustees, whoever comes, and deals with our estate after this, handle it. But for a lot of clients, their primary residence might be part of how they're going to pay for long-term care, how they're envisioning paying for some of those things in retirement. So we should start thinking about when are we going to need to access these dollars, and how do we do that in the most appropriate way? How do we start thinking about getting ahead of those things and timing, not the market, but timing when we need to spend the money, and then saying, is this the right type of investment to be holding based on when we need to spend that money? So when it comes to the housing market, I'll put Josh back up here. We're going to talk about a couple of financial planning considerations and then take your questions. I just want you to know this, the housing market has outpaced inflation. Not by a dramatic amount, but by some. Real estate overall has been a growth asset, right? But the risk we face is that everything we need to buy is going to cost us more every year for the rest of our life. The hedge against that is to be invested correctly in the US equity market. Okay. All right, I'm going to put Josh back up here, stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to walk through a couple of scenarios. We'll get his take as a CFP on it. As we're going through this, feel free if you'd like to. I'm going to make a shift here real quick and make it so that people can also ask questions. I'm going to turn everybody's mic on here or give everyone mic access. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can kick your mic on and shout at us, and you can ask us a question verbally. Otherwise, throw it up in the chat. Happy to talk about the housing market, interest rates, some some of the stuff I just covered in terms of the real risk. Oh, I should also say my answer to that client of ours was, as much as it doesn't feel fun, you're already positioned correctly for dealing with today's market. Because being positioned correctly for today's market is about aligning the assets that we own with when we need to spend the money. I said, if we take a guess that Trump or the Trump administration is going to destroy the economy, we're likely to be wrong. Just like we would have been wrong if we thought Biden was going to destroy the economy if we were on the other side of the fence. And just like we would have been wrong if we would have thought Trump 1.0 would have destroyed the economy, or Barack Obama before that, right? Just like track back through and recognize that the history of the US equity market has been that regardless of political administration, we're ready. But getting ready to spend that money in retirement means aligning the right types of assets for when we need to spend the money. And that's the core of what Lifeworks does. Okay, so Josh, I also had one question I was going to seed into this, because this is one that came up on after last month's webinar with a client. The client asked us about reverse mortgages as a way of potentially accessing the equity in their home, or starting to think about providing some cash for retirement income expenses. First of all, what is a reverse mortgage? What is a likely a good use of reverse mortgage for somebody? Maybe, I know we're going to be talking generically here, but a good use or a proper use of reverse mortgage in someone's financial plan.
Yeah, that's a great question. So sort of setting the stage of what like a reverse mortgage is, it's basically, I mean, as the name suggests, it's kind of the reverse of a typical mortgage in a lot of ways. So instead of you taking a loan from the bank and then paying your mortgage to the bank, basically what you do is you sort of take your home, offer it up as collateral to the bank. So the bank basically, when you set up the reverse mortgage, they own your property. But that being said, there's a lot of stipulations, like they're not going to kick you out and kick you to the streets day one. Typically it's at the death of the second spouse is usually how they're set up, right? So like the second spouse passes away, bank gets the asset, they can then sell it, right? But then what they do in the meantime is, and there's typically two different ways of doing it. One is sort of like as a line of credit. One is more of a annuity, or like a more traditional mortgage, where they basically take the value of your property and they say like, okay, we think your property is worth $1 million. We're willing to give you X in terms of loan, and then you can just start taking cash from it. And it can either be a fixed monthly payment that comes to you over an express period of time. Say like, again, for like life until the second spouse passes away, you could get, say, $4,000 a month, or it could be like a line of credit where you just have it for emergencies. So in kind of how we think about this and from a planning context is, one, if you're not having your house for legacy purposes, where you're planning on just giving it to your kids, well, there could be a lot of value stored in your property, especially today, right? Kind of like we talked about. So you could use that as an income source to fuel your retirement. You can use it as an emergency fund almost in case like those sad but inevitable things for a lot of people happen, like long-term care situations, or just hey, we ran out of assets at the end of retirement, or we lived longer than we expected. Like these life experiences just can happen, right? But having something like a reverse mortgage available can just be an extra layer of insurance for making sure you get through retirement okay. And one of the things, and kind of one of the reasons we wanted to bring that up now, is basically, again, we have no crystal ball in terms of predicting the future and where we are in the real estate market cycle or anything like that. But one thing we do know is there are a lot of risks in the real estate markets right now. We do know that real estate values are high, and that's part of the reason that's causing some of the risks. So doing things like locking in a reverse mortgage now, if it's something you think you're going to need, could be really valuable in terms of planning for your cash flow and planning for your needs through retirement or through estate plan.
Yeah, a good example here, folks, and why I think reverse mortgages have gotten a bad rap by lots of maybe people that talk about them. and I haven't done thousands of them over the years. LifeWorks doesn't write reverse mortgages, but I have advised a lot of clients on it. I'm going to give two planning examples. One, if right now property values across the US for the most part, maybe minus a few areas that Josh called out, hurricane, fire, and some of the ones that maybe were over leveraged with Airbnb rentals that are seeing some price declines. For the rest of us in kind of normal real estate markets, real estate's at all-time high valuations. If you were to, potentially put a reverse mortgage in place and do like the line of credit reverse mortgage option, it's done at today's current value. And the way that it works on the reverse mortgage side, Josh kind of mentioned it, but these are essentially what are called non-recourse loans, meaning you don't ever have to pay them back. And your heirs, if they ever wanted to redeem the house, right, to pay the loan off, they're capped at either paying the loan balance off or 95% of the appraised value. There's never a world in which to save your home, or if your kids eventually wanted at some point in time, right, where they would have to pay 200% of the value of the home back or something like this. There's actually a cap on it. It's 95% of the appraised value at the time that you're either looking to sell it or potentially an heir or somebody buying it back, or the loan balance, okay? So covering long-term care costs, having some available liquidity, that's a planning consideration. I'm going to give another one that is a place that I've started working with our advisors and talking about being recommended more. If you're in the baby boomer generation and you have adult children, this message is for you. Your kids likely need your help more now when they're in the younger curve of their stage of life, having kids, buying homes, paying off student loans, et cetera, and stuff like that. They probably could use more financial support, assistance, time, energy, and love from their parents today than when they're 60 and you're 85. A mistake I see being made by families all the time is, one, they don't talk about money with their kids. I'm going to do an entire webinar series on how to approach this, because I see, and this is 20 years of anecdotal data, people would rather talk about politics or sex at the dinner table than about their estate plan or their money with their kids. And it's a giant swing and miss. But an example here, I'll digress from that, but an example here on the planning side that I think is really an interesting thing. Let's say, again, that you're in the baby boomer generation, you're 65, to 70, you're fairly early in retirement. You have plenty of assets, saved in your investment accounts plus your Social Security, and you're looking at your 35-year-old or maybe 40-year-old kid or something like this, or maybe you have grandkids by now that are graduating college. One suggestion might be, instead of this idea that somewhere down the road when you die, you'll leave them your house, they're going to sell it and turn it into cash, but it's likely your kids won't need that cash by that point in their life. A reverse mortgage could also be a way to start thinking about doing lifetime gifting, right, today. And this isn't going to apply to everybody, so this is not a, grandmother's elixir, everybody should rush out and do it. But, if you had let's just use an example. Let's say you have a $600,000 valued house and it's paid off, and you get a reverse mortgage line of credit for $300,000, right? You could use those dollars to maybe pay off kids' student loans, or to help them with a down payment in today's world where home prices are quite high and interest rates are high and it's fairly unaffordable, right? You could think about doing things during life and potentially using this asset that's on your balance sheet that generally is underutilized and then sold at someone's death. So just a planning consideration. If you can, I found over, again, my 20 years of doing this, that when parents and grandparents can benefit kids and grandkids during life with lifetime giving, one, it's more fun because you're not dead. You actually get to participate in it, right? But two, we're actually aligning when they likely need the financial assistance with your ability to do it. So a couple of planning things. Josh kind of hit on one, which is this could be a way of thinking about setting yourself up to have another level of potential access to cash in the event that you need it because you're living longer, starting to run out of funds, long-term care, something like this. Another planning example here with your real estate would be potentially thinking about using a reverse mortgage or leveraging your real estate today to do some lifetime giving or lifetime wealth transfer. So I'll pause there a second. There might be some questions that pop up. Go ahead, Josh.
Real quick, wanted to chime in on that too. So one interesting component right now too, as part of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act that was enacted in Trump 1, and is likely to be, a lot of it maybe made permanent here in the near future. The estate tax exclusion is higher than most of us will ever see. So basically, from an estate perspective, you're allowed to gift up to, I forget the exact number right now, it's like 14.5 million, either through your life or through death, tax-free.
Per person. So a husband and wife can do like 25, 27, something like this, 25, $26 million.
Exactly. And so, again, so you don't necessarily need to wait to pass away to provide that money to kids, or do some of that plan that Ron's referring to. You can do it now tax-free. The only implication really is you have to file a gift tax return if you're higher than 17,000 in terms of a gift, but that's it. And that's really
great point.
Hurdle.
Yep, great point. Okay, we covered a lot today, lots of slides. I appreciate everybody being here. We love getting to do these. We have scheduled till 4:30 for Q&A. So if anybody has any questions, send us your hardest ones. Let's play Try and Stump Josh. I see Alex, our Chief Investment Officer, on here too, and a few of other advisors. So if anybody has any questions, now's a great time to throw them out. We're happy to jump back into the slides and cover a specific thing. If there's something going on in the market, tax policy, something unrelated to today's presentation, but you want to ask a question about it, feel free to either type it in the chat, or I unlocked your mic. And if you want to turn your mic on, your menu bar at the bottom of the screen, you can kick that mic on and introduce yourself. We're happy to field those questions. So I'm going to wait 60 seconds, which will feel like forever, and somebody will have a question for us. Ooh, great question from Jeff. Should we consider downsizing homes now before the rush of sales? I'll answer, and then I'll let Josh answer, and then the next question I'll let him go first, and I'll go second. I think that if I apply the methodology that Lifeworks uses for how we allocate our clients' assets in the market, meaning we look at when we need to spend the money, and we make sure we are owning the right asset and we're preparing to turn it into cash for when we need it. I would suggest that if you can downsize today, when markets are still at all-time highs in terms of real estate values, by the way, you can exempt $500,000 of gain from your income tax return on the sale of a primary residence. You can do that every 2 years. So if you've been in your house a while, say that again, Josh?
If you're married, otherwise $250.
If you're married, sorry. If you're married, it's $250 a person, $500,000 married filing jointly, that you can exclude from the capital gain on the sale of your home. So if you bought your home for $100,000 20 years ago and it's worth $600,000 today, you can sell it for $600,000 and essentially realize all that tax-free. So I think downsizing in a market where values are still at all-time highs, there's low supply, we haven't started to see selling pressure yet from the baby boomer generation, right? Another thing to think about here, and I didn't cover this in that graph, but when people are forced to sell, which a lot of Americans will be because their home is their largest asset, when people are forced to sell, they don't get to make decisions around the when and how much they sell it for, right? It's like, if they're going into a nursing home, assisted care facility, something like this, a lot of times those things become fire sales, right? So the value actually we might start seeing, kind of downward pressure on values as well, just because of, forced sales due to, deaths or people going nursing homes. So I think it would be wise if it doesn't impact or change your quality of life and how you want to live today, Jeff. So if your family has a value that you like to have kids, grandkids, everybody over for the holidays, and maybe that big house provides the forum for it, I think there's still an argument to putting how you want to live above the financial aspect of it. But there definitely is some wisdom in saying, hey, if this isn't going to affect our quality of life, and we could downsize, maybe reduce our expenses, capture some of this value tax-free, certainly would be a wise thing to do. And I think it's probably going to be, better in the environment we're in now, at least, where we have very low inventory and high demand still, than when that cycle flips over. And it will, right? The economy does move in cycles. Nobody can predict when. But when that turns and all of a sudden there's more sellers than there are buyers, I think that's when you'd see it. Josh, we're gonna go to Richard's question here. He just raised his hand, but do you want to add anything to that, or are you good with that answer?
Only thing I would really add, excuse me, only thing I would really add is like, one thing to kind of consider with it is there's always trade-offs for these decisions. So like if you're going to sell, you have to buy something at an appreciated value as well. And if you're going to have a mortgage on it, like on the new property, then there's going to be a higher mortgage cost at the moment. So really it does boil down to like, is this a right decision for your lifestyle, and the like kind of like Ron was saying, the lifestyle you want to live? Because it's not always going to be a clear-cut, dry, like mathematical answer. Like part of it is really, your home is where you're going to spend the rest of your life. Like you want to enjoy it, because there are going to be trade-offs one way or another.
All right, Richard, I think your mic's unmuted. If you want to toss a question out there, go for it.
Oh, you're still muted.
We'll try again. Hang on, Richard, you're still muted on us here. All right, try it again. Nope, still can't hear him. Sometimes this venue doesn't like people's mics. Yeah, I'm sorry, Richard. We still, for whatever reason, your mic's still not picking up. If you want to type your question in, or if you want to keep playing around with it, there's no rush. We'll put you back at the top of the line. I had this problem a week ago on this platform where it wasn't recognizing my AirPods, and it was driving me nuts. So. Okay, Angela had a question in here. I'm just going to read it out loud. If I have aging parents that need cash, we'll jump back to yours in just a second, Richard. If I have aging parents that need cash and should sell, would it make sense if I purchase and pay the parents? Ideally, it's a good neighborhood, but very old, not structurally sound home that would need to be completely rebuilt. So, double question in here. One is it a good investment to do something like that? Okay, definitely talking specifics about it, and would have to talk specifics. If part of buying it from them and giving them some cash is to keep them in the house, right? If that's not the case, then I would just say have them sell it in the primary market and just capture the cash and let it be what it is. If you think that there's a good, go ahead.
Or this is a prime example of
reverse mortgage. Yeah. But if they don't necessarily need to stay in the house, it's just a matter of, maybe creating the cash that they need to live on. Looking at it as an investment, like, hey, we could buy it for a good price, rehab it, flip it, sell it, or hold it, or something like that, I think is a very different analysis. But generally speaking, unless you're loaning them the money and buying it from them to help them like stay in the house when they can't afford it, I wouldn't go that route unless you absolutely had to. Generally speaking. Oh, okay. Fun question here. Richard, did you get your microphone working yet? No? Okay. If you want to type your question, I apologize that that's not working. I'm going to jump. Fred has one here. He said, I heard Ron use a phrase in a YouTube presentation, but he didn't elaborate. It might not be relevant to today's topic, but if you can briefly describe the phrase God, gold, and guns. Sure. I don't know what presentation it was that phrase or that kind of, structure was presented, but it probably was in some kind of context like this. I got asked a lot during COVID and even in subsequent years on this type of interaction. Hey, the US government is at 30 trillion of debt, 35 trillion of debt, 40 trillion of debt. they seem to be no end in sight. The amount of interest that the US government's going to be paying on its long-term debt is larger than we're spending on national defense or Social Security. Like, is it sustainable? What if the dollar crashes? Usually what would happen is when we played out a logical scenario, somebody might say to me, well, what happens if the dollar crashes or the US government defaults on its debt, right? In fact, Alex and I had a exchange maybe 3 years ago that was a lot of fun, where we were talking about how the real value of the dollar is backed by the US military. That's another kind of thing. But the reference to God, gold, and guns, as I said this, we can't plan. I think this is the reference. When we're doing financial planning and investment planning, we're not planning for financial Armageddons. Okay? Because if you believe the dollar is going to crash and therefore you should own gold, you also need to have God and guns. Because if you have God but no gold and guns, now again, for everybody with a faith-based perspective, of which I have one, this is not me preaching, right? From a practical standpoint, it would be hard to buy groceries. In the event of some kind of financial Armageddon, right? The idea would be you would need to defend the value of your physical assets, and in would come guns. So I've used this in the context before to say that when we're planning, we can't get sucked into this idea of like, the dollar crashing, the US government, going bankrupt, stocks going to zero, because those kind of like Armageddons are really not something you can plan for, because the end result of that would be you should really just have God, gold, and guns. And you'd need all three of them to survive, right? So there are people out there that are what we call gold bugs. And in the Midwest where I live, there are a fair number of very conservative individuals that have a strong sense of belief in their God, gold, and guns at different magnitudes. But that's not financial planning, right? That's like apocalyptic, the world's coming to an end type of planning, and you should take it to its logical conclusion, which is, can you live off the grid with no support from utilities and infrastructure and petrol and things like this? And the answer for most people is no. So we try and stay out of doing apocalyptic type of planning or addressing those scenarios, because there's no rational way to get there other than to go to fully self-sustaining. And most people can't do that. And that's really not our job as financial advisors, financial planners, nor would I encourage you to approach your financial planning or your investments that way. So that's probably the context of it, is the end of a economic reset or the collapse of a country's currency or the collapse of civil society, is you could only rely on God, gold, and guns. All right, Richard's question. Sorry again that you couldn't get your mic to work. Josh, do you want to take this one? What about downsizing, but renting instead of buying, utilizing cash and not worrying about maintenance? I like that question. That's a really good one.
I personally am a fan of this for a lot of ways. I mean, the primary way, and Ron kind of alluded this in earlier part of the conversation, I sort of view your home not as an investment, as an expense, whether you own it or whether you rent it. It is a lifestyle choice that, can vary in expense and, in quality, but at the end of the day, it's an expense. Like we were talking about with like reverse mortgage and stuff, there are ways to tap into that value. But when you're in retirement, this is one of the main ways that you can tap into that value, is converting it from an expense to an asset and then using it to fund a different expense. But, also then you can tap into the equity and invest it and have just more flexibility in kind of how it's utilized, how it's grown, all those different components. The downside, obviously, you have less control over the place you live when it's a rented property, but kind of like you alluded to, Richard, like it's, has its perks as well, especially for a lot of retirees that may not be able to handle a lot of maintenance and stuff anymore. I know my grandparents were this way, where they moved into that sort of facility where, there's, greenskeepers and, people that come help with like maintenance and cleaning and things like that. It can make your life a lot easier being in that situation, especially in a retirement scenario. Just, bodies get older and bodies stop working the way they used to, right? And not having to deal with a lot of that stuff can be can be wonderful for your quality of life and allow you to focus on your family and your, traveling and things that you want to be doing. So I think it's a great option personally.
Yeah, I would second it. I won't add much to it, but a couple of thoughts. For most of us, our real estate isn't that great of an investment when we actually factor in taxes, maintenance, upkeep. I say that as there's a demo crew at my house right now ripping off the siding, windows, doors, gutters, roof, and essentially doing a rebuild on the outside. But for somebody, there is a trend. Our team has been talking a little bit more about this because we think it's appropriate. There's a really great case if it's not for, if it wasn't for maybe children at home and school systems and wanting to have some certainty around, kind of how your family's living, renting can actually probably be a net positive relative to owning. For a lot of people in states that have high high property taxes, we're not getting to fully deduct those on our tax returns, right? Because the state and local income tax cap, whether that goes away, I don't know. So there actually has been a trend of people on let's say the very wealthy end of the spectrum actually like divesting of individual real estate that they would hold for their use and just renting because there's more flexibility. It actually probably at the end of the day comes out in the wash where renting is not more expensive or less expensive. You just don't have to deal with the maintenance, upkeep, and things like that. So it's a worth considering. It's certainly worth considering as part of your financial plan. All right, these are really great questions. We got about 10 more minutes left. I'm happy to stay on just a little bit longer if we do have some more good questions, but anybody with final questions, or if you want to kick your mic on as well, feel free. Love getting to do these back and forths. All right, Isaiah's got a big question for us. Would there be any benefit to gifting or transferring real estate through a trust versus outright selling the property in the current market? Are trusts even worth bringing up, or does it just depend on the individual goals? Okay, I'll stab at this one first, and then Josh can jump in, correct me from a tax perspective as we go. Transferring an asset to a trust for most people and in most scenarios is not considered a sale. So the typical trusts that most people have and that we would recommend all of our clients have are what are called a revocable or a living trust, meaning for tax purposes, for asset protection purposes, it's whether you own it in your personal name, you and your spouse's personal names, or whether your revocable trust owns it, it's viewed as one and the same, right? So if I transfer, which my house, my title of my house is actually held by my revocable trust. Now, why did I do that? Well, if I kick the bucket tomorrow and die, that asset skips probate and it's managed by my trust. But during my lifetime, it doesn't actually provide any tax benefits to do that. It doesn't provide any asset protection. So some of the things we're talking about now wouldn't apply. Now, there is a second type of trust, broadly speaking, that's called an irrevocable trust. And an irrevocable trust is one in which the trust is a separate and distinct taxpayer from the person who's making gifts to it. So if I took my house and I gifted it to an irrevocable trust, that would be considered an economic transfer. It would be considered either a gift or some type of sale. There would be some tax ramifications to that. And the IRS would say, Ron no longer owns that asset. That's now owned by this distinct tax-paying trust. Estate planning and wealth transfer across generations, doing that can be a very valuable, a very worthwhile planning endeavor. Okay, there is a lot of complexities about transferring real estate that you still live in to one of those irrevocable trusts. Because if I could just transfer something or gift it to a trust and say, hey, I no longer own it, so I don't have to worry about the estate taxes on it. Now I don't have to worry about the income taxes on it, but I'm going to stay living in it and enjoy the use and benefit of it. The IRS comes and goes, wait, hang on a second. You have all the economic benefits, you have access to it, you have control over it, you have decisions around it. That really wasn't a transfer. So can it be done? Yes, there is some very technical planning that you could do around transferring real estate to an irrevocable trust. Oftentimes, assets that are best to do that type of multi-generational wealth transfer planning would be investment real estate, would be stocks, things that you believe are going to appreciate significantly in value. And the idea is you make that transfer, that gift today, get it out of your taxable estate, get it to your, say, kids, grandkids, or next generation, right? But that wouldn't be part of what some of the previous conversations were around, like kind of locking in the value today, right? That we would maybe have from a sale perspective. So trusts, the second half of your question, trusts are always worth bringing up. Everybody should have a trust regardless of their worth. I should say that everybody that owns something, whether if you own a house or even some investment accounts, trusts are a very, very easy way of avoiding unnecessary probate costs and messy estate settlements. And if you haven't been through that yet as an adult, trust me, it's just a painful process of paperwork. So we try and have all of our clients here at LifeWorks have a revocable living trust in their name and or them and their spouse's name, just to make managing of the estate at their death and the probate rules streamlined, efficient, less costly, things like that. So good question, Isaiah.
The other add-on here too is if you're planning to sell it, transferring it to an irrevocable trust would actually be very detrimental. One, because especially depending on how what the value was that you transferred it, but when you sell it in a trust has a different tax bracket than individuals do, and it's much more restrictive and much more aggressive. So you can get taxed much more heavily on the sale of a property, plus you lose the $500,000 exclusion when you transfer it in as well. So long story short, from a tax perspective, could have a lot of detrimental impacts, and tread lightly. But that being said, with revocable, it's basically just an extension of you and has no impacts. And yeah, like Ron said, it's something that everybody should do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, final questions as we're wrapping up. That was a really great couple part question there. Love the questions so far. We'll stick around and maybe take one or two more. If you have to jump, I guess if you're leaving or you've left already, we just want to let you know that we are honored and we love getting to serve you and your families. Don't hesitate to reach out to your advisor, anybody on the LifeWorks team. If you have any questions about this, we're happy to help. This is what we love doing. So thank you for being here today. I hope you found today's market update to be informational and valuable. We'll be publishing the dates for the April, May, and June ones next week, and also those topics. Quick heads up, our focus in Q2 is risk management and taxes. One of those is one of my favorite subjects, the other one is not. I'm going to be talking in April a fair amount about risk management, and not just insurance, but things like digital privacy, cybersecurity, asset protection techniques in the real world that I believe everybody should be doing, whether you're worth $10 million, $100 million, or $1 million. So thank you for being here. Anybody have any questions? Josh and I'll be around for a couple more minutes. Otherwise, God bless. Don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything, and we hope to see you back next month for our next market update. So I got a direct message from Milan. I'll respond to that one via email, Milan. That's a really great point. And I'll send you an email and maybe go back and forth with you on how to do a better job kind of opening and explaining all of the different things that make LifeWorks unique to spouses and family members that might not interact with you or the advisor that's working with you as regularly. So that's a really great point. I'll shoot you an email yet tonight, and maybe we can connect on that. All right, question from Scott. Let's see here. Considering real estate investment property second homes in the current status of inflated pricing and the potential for deflation, would you expect that particular real estate market to be flooded and follow the deflation, or maintain their higher valuation with limited opportunities? Hard to prognosticate on when, but knowing that things do move in cycles, what goes up tends to go down, maybe with the exception of inflation. That seems to be the steady drumbeat that exists. But I would think that we'd likely see, whether it's due to the baby boomers having to sell their real estate off either voluntarily or involuntarily, right, downsizing or dying, going into nursing homes, that there's likely to be a significant increase in inventory over time. If we also get really nerdy for a minute and look at the birth rates in the U.S., they're barely above what we would call replacement rate right now. So part of what drove the massive economic growth in the 80s and 90s was the baby boomer generation, which was one of the largest kind of like population explosions coming out of World War II, right? And so there was this massive increase in demand because there was a significantly growing population. Right now, the millennial generation and the Gen Zers is a larger group of, larger population block than the baby boomers, but they're still not at the same rates of like home ownership and things like that. So all that being said, all these baby boomer homes, as they turn over, right, due to deaths, downsizing, moving into nursing homes, that's likely going to create more inventory than there's buyers out there, at least in the short, let's say the next, 5 to 10 years. And I would think the logical conclusion of that might be some downward pressure on the values. Now, what could put a monkey wrench in that very logical conclusion? The Federal Reserve and the US government pushing interest rates back to zero and kind of artificially holding them there, right? Things where that, Federal Reserve's intervention into the markets can push certain asset classes in certain directions in terms of pricing. But if they start dropping interest rates dramatically, even with maybe more properties for sale on the market, we'd get people stepping in to buy for speculative reasons. We get people that weren't buyers before that now are buyers because they're like, hey, I can get a 3% 30-year mortgage again or something like this. So there's definitely levers or mechanics that could be pulled that might impact the normal kind of supply-demand pricing curve that should exist in real estate. So if we could hold all of those things equal, I would say there's probably less upside in real estate today, given residential real estate, given the trajectory of the demographics. But we just don't know what some of those other levers are or what the government might do policy-wise that could impact, people's desire to be a homeowner or their ability to afford a house or something like that. So hopefully that answers that question, but that's definitely a good one. I would step cautiously into, as Josh mentioned before, if it is an investment property, I would not be making assumptions that property is going to have like double-digit appreciation to it. I would be looking at investment property either one, because it has a beach view or something like this, right? And I want to have that for quality of life. Or I would be looking at it from a return on cash, meaning if I put $1 million in, what's the yield I'm going to get back on my cash, right? And I would be looking at it more from an income perspective, as opposed to like, hey, I'm going to buy this house in Miami, and all I have to do is sit on it for 2 years because home prices in Miami are going up 10% a year. Like, I don't think that game's going to continue forever. So great question. All right, I think we'll end it there. Josh, any closing thoughts? We're a couple minutes over. Great job with all the research you did and the team putting all those slides together, but any closing thoughts as we sign off?
No, I mean, I think the biggest thought and takeaway is just make sure you're communicating with your advisor on all these things, especially from a planning perspective, to make sure, everything as part of your plan is accounted for, and that you're just having open and honest conversations about worries, fears, and everything that could impact your life, because we want you to live in the best life possible. And we want to help you do that. So, just make sure you're communicating these things with your advisor, and, always feel free to reach out to us for any help.
Awesome. And again, from all of us here at Lifeworks, which I get to speak for, one of the things I love about my job as a CEO, we are honored to get to serve you and your family. We love what we do, and we look forward to having you on another one of our educational webinars. Be watching your email inbox over the next couple of days. We'll have the next 3 months dates published, so you can get them on your calendar. And then we'll also have a link to the recording of today's session available as well. Have a great rest of your day. God bless. Have a great week. Look forward to seeing you on another Lifeworks market update soon. Take care.